I'd like to start off with a question to you about the Confrontation Clause of the Constitution. I know you and I have had this conversation in the past. Do you believe that this bill does not violate the Confrontation Clause? Is that your position?
It has been my position and the position of the majority that the bill in no way violates the Constitution of the United States, the Constitution of the State of New York.
Okay. Specifically in that Constitution, there's something called the Confrontation Clause, and the Confrontation Clause allows an individual to have the opportunity to confront their accuser, not just in the courtroom, but also at the time of the alleged infraction or occurrence. Does the individual receiving the summons have the opportunity at the time of the infraction to confront their accuser under this bill?
I know. It is quite similar to receiving a ticket at a parking meter or at an alternate side parking violation. If you are not in your car, the car is parked in a no parking zone, and appropriate authority puts a ticket on the car. You are not there to confront the individual. Nobody has yet proven the unconstitutionality of parking violations. I look forward to your opportunity to take that to the Supreme Court if you care to, but I believe this is similar. It is similar to to red light cameras, which have sustained the constitutionality of this mechanism for enforcing our traffic laws.
And Ms. Glick, you made the analogy between somebody receiving a parking ticket, but do we have some automated system whereby a camera captures a photograph of a car parked in a parking spot where the meter has expired, and then instantaneously they receive a summons? Do we have a system like that? Or do we have a system where an individual...
Will the gentleman yield to a question?
Ms. Glick asked you to yield.
Certainly.
Mr. Castorina says yes.
Sure.
Are these serious questions?
They're very serious questions, and actually, they're very serious questions, and if you would listen to them and give them a little bit of your attention, you might actually learn something. So I'm going to ask again, do we have a system by which we have cameras that automatically give a summons to an individual when their vehicle is in a parking spot past the time allotted for a parking meter? Do we have a system like that? Because I don't believe we do. And you just made that analogy, so I don't see the parallel.
Well, an analogy is not always precise, but it is sort of like a metaphor, which is not always precise, but implies the same thing. So what I was saying to you was that in the argument I believe you were making was that individuals who receive a violation either from a speed camera or a red light camera, which is also a system which exists in the city of New York and which I do not believe has been challenged successfully on constitutional grounds, that the analogy was to the fact that there isn't an immediate opportunity necessarily for someone who's received a parking ticket to confront the person who has given the parking ticket in the same way that with a speed camera or a red light camera, there isn't an immediate opportunity to contest it at the time. It was an analogy not necessarily intended to provide an exact
I understand, and I think you've made my point. My point is that there would be an individual, a person, who would write out the summons to the individual who received the parking ticket. Now, if they were not present at the time that the summons was issued, naturally they wouldn't be able to confront their accuser. But they would then have the opportunity in a tribunal or a court to confront their accuser as to the summons in person with that individual in a courtroom. In the case where you have speed cameras, you don't have a person doing the accusing. What you have is machinery. Isn't that true? And isn't that the distinction?
Well, regrettably, I have received a parking ticket on 1 or 2 occasions in the distant past. And when I went to contest it, I didn't meet anybody who had written the ticket. I was there with what I believe was maybe an administrative law judge who asked if there was any evidence that I could present that I actually had a reason for either being acquitted of the full value of the ticket, or by merely showing up out of the kindness of their heart, they reduced the cost of the ticket. I don't believe that people actually getting a parking ticket in New York City actually have the opportunity to appear and confront, your language, not mine, the person who wrote the ticket.
So if somebody speeds in New York City and they receive a speeding ticket physically from an officer, would they have an opportunity to confront that officer at the courtroom?
I'm sorry?
If an officer provides a ticket to somebody who they believe is speeding and they physically give them the summons, do they have the opportunity to confront that officer in the courtroom?
Never having had a speeding ticket, I can't answer that directly. From personal experience, it has been my understanding from other people that frequently the party does not show up and the judge makes a decision.
What if I were to tell you that the police officer is mandated to be present in the courtroom and that the individual who is accused does have the opportunity at that time to confront not only the police officer, but the device that is utilized to determine what the speed was that the police officer determined it was based upon that machinery for the purposes of the issuance of the summons?
I'll accept that.
Okay. Well, then we can move on to the next point. Thank you. Speed cameras are also deemed generally as a form of mass surveillance over ordinary drivers, okay? Because they're constantly working. Isn't that correct? The cameras are constantly working during the times that school is ongoing. Is that correct?
I would assume so.
Okay. Now, isn't it true that the government is forbidden from engaging in sweeping surveillance systems without warrants?
I don't believe that it is.
Let me just finish the question. Sweeping surveillance systems without warrants to look for offenders of any crimes. In other words, kind of like a trap. Isn't it true that the government is forbidden without search warrant to do so?
I don't believe that a fixed area for a limited period of time each day would qualify as mass surveillance. I will just remind the gentleman that the areas involved are surrounding our school buildings, and that the intention of the bill is not to identify people who are traveling slightly, 5 miles an hour, 10 miles? The cameras are calibrated to actually generate a violation when one has exceeded the speed limit by 11 miles. Now, part of that the whole rationale is that if an individual is hit by a car speeding at traveling at 30 miles an hour, you have a reasonable chance of surviving. If, on the other hand, you're hit by a vehicle traveling at 40 or 45 miles an hour, you stand almost no chance of surviving. So you alleged that there was an attempt, I think, to catch people in a crime. The crime is actually speeding above the speed limit. This is actually allowing people 11 miles an hour above that. So,
Ms. Glick, forgive me, but I do agree that the underlying reasons for the bill are in fact noble. I don't have an issue with that. I do, however, take issue with the means employed to accomplish that particular goal. Don't you agree that there might be a different or better way to accomplish the goal without the utilization of this type of surveillance? Particularly,
no.
Let me finish, please. I know you're so eager, but let me just finish. Perhaps by using speed bumps or other devices within the design of a road, stop signs, yield signs, and a variety of other traffic devices, wouldn't those less intrusive means that do not trample upon our great Constitution, wouldn't they be better means to employ than this mass, wide sweeping surveillance that you have in this bill?
Obviously, I do not agree.
Do you agree that speed bumps actually slow down drivers?
I have not done a study of the relative effectiveness of a speed bump. I think that if you have a speed bump and somebody is not slowing down, you have the possibility that the vehicle will actually go airborne and thereby create a more hazardous condition. So I can't today say that that would actually create a safer environment than utilizing the means of using a camera.
That's interesting, Ms. Glick, because the camera doesn't actually slow down or stop the driver at the time of the incident. Isn't that correct? Isn't it true that the speed bump would actually have...
Hold on, Mr. Buckwell, why do you rise?
Does Mr. Castorina yield to a question?
Would Mr. Castorina, will you yield?
Absolutely.
Mr. Castorina yields.
Would the gentleman agree that, in fact, studies show that at times speed bumps, if placed improperly, actually can speed up cars, because when someone's getting between speed bumps, they tend to try to make up their time, and so therefore, although someone obviously slows down for the speed bump, they try to then zoom after that, maybe to the next speed bump or wherever they're going. So in fact, even a speed bump can actually speed up in certain locations people's travel.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Buckwell. I don't agree that those facts are accurate. I do see how you can make that inference, but in my experience, generally speaking, speed bumps are placed not just one at a time, but they're placed in close proximity. And when placed in close proximity, it would be physically impossible for folks to, once they get over the speed bump, to gather or garner enough speed and then slow down again within the next interval of the next speed bump. So I don't see how that would be accurate under those facts.
Well, Mr. Speaker, if I could, I say this respectfully as former chairman of the Traffic Commission of the City of White Plains. In fact, studies show that when speed bumps are placed, in fact, multiple speed bumps along a road, drivers do tend to speed up between the speed bumps in order to make up time.
Mr. Buckwell, you need to pose that in a question, and
I would just
like to continue with the sponsor.
I think you're going to have to come back for a second because we have elapsed the time allowed for the moment.
Ms. Glick, you know, we spend an awful lot of time talking about the amount of revenue that the city collects from this program, I think that you'll admit. But what I'd like to know is who is or what is the company that is utilized for the purposes of handling this operation? In other words, the company that manufactures the cameras and maintains them and is in charge of the billing practices.
Well, to tell you the truth, I have not looked into the contract because my focus has been on the fact that if people don't speed, they don't get a ticket. If there is a person who reviews the material and there are steps involved in ascertaining that the cameras are properly calibrated, etc. But I have not looked at the contract because that has not been what I believe is the salient point of the legislation.
Ms. Glick,
I'm sorry, I get to answer the questions.
I'm sorry, I thought you were done. I'm sorry, go ahead.
So I have not believed that the contract for whether it's company A or B or whether there are two different companies, that has not been my concern. My concern has been ensuring that if people speed in a school zone, that they get a ticket, and hopefully that will then get it into their head that when they are near schools, they should slow down.
Ms. Glick, you are in luck because I've gone ahead and I've found out who that company is or what that company is. And it's called American Traffic Solutions Incorporated. Are you familiar with the name of that company?
That rings a bell.
Would it surprise you if I told you that that corporation is located outside of the state of New York and in the state of Arizona?
Makes no difference to me.
Would it make a difference to you if I told you that they make a commission on every ticket that is written?
No.
That wouldn't make a difference? Well, let me ask you a question. Would you say that it is practically impossible for a motorist or the registered owner of a vehicle to contest one of these tickets that are issued as a result of a speed camera closing its shutter in the process of what it does?
Well, what I would say to that is that there is an 11-mile-an-hour buffer.
I heard that. You
well,
said
I'm sorry.
that before.
You asked a question, and I am answering it.
I understand.
So my view is that the fact that somebody gets a violation based on going 11 miles over the speed limit, in many instances, if there is, I don't know how the contract is, that may have been a cheaper way of constructing a contract. I'm not a procurement officer, so that is not my concern. My concern is that we get people to slow down and not kill as many kids as have been killed in the past.
I'm with you on that, and I think it's laudable. I think that is absolutely laudable. But my question was, and this is important, is it possible to beat one of these tickets? And my hypothesis is that it is practically impossible to beat one of these tickets. And as a result, if you couple that with the notion that this out-of-state company gets a commission per each ticket that's given, that's administered, well, do they have any type of reason not to make sure that these tickets are processed and processed and processed and administered to motorists because they have a vested monetary interest in the outcome, which is that they get a commission for every summons that is given?
Well, I don't share your cynicism.
Well, it's not cynicism. It's if there is a commission for each ticket that is given. It's fact. And if it's true, then shouldn't we, as members of the legislature, have some significant concerns as to the motives and intent of an out-of-state corporation for profit who is selling this system to the city of New York?
Well, I would say to you that tickets are sent along with photographic evidence. I believe that people could go to traffic court and try to contest the ticket. I don't believe that in some instances where there's been actually a reduction in the number of violations posted, that one can say that there is an obvious incentive for there to be fraud, because I do believe that if they were doing it based on what you're suggesting, which is that they are motivated to simply issue tickets willy-nilly without them actually issuing a ticket based on a violation over 11 miles an hour beyond the speed limit, that they would in fact be liable. And so I believe that they are acting in an appropriate fashion until somebody demonstrates otherwise.
But Ms. Glick, isn't it true that you're basing this opinion on blind faith and not on any verifiable report? Because you've indicated that there is no report present for us members of the legislature to review, and I recall that being the same thing last year. So aren't you just resting your opinion on blind faith and just not really getting into the nitty-gritty as we should?
No, actually, I believe if we go back a few years and we had this similar conversation, and perhaps it was actually with your colleague, I could identify out of the voluminous material presented, which was then distilled into a summary report, that we could identify specific areas, actually in Staten Island, where there were cameras available and where they were demonstrated that fewer violations had been issued.
Okay, but this is a project that started last year, and you have no data on this particular project, but you do have data on a similar project, but not this one, and last year we didn't have any data as well. I'm going to ask another question. Are you familiar with something known as the chain of custody in evidence matters?
Mr. Castorina, though I am not an attorney, I have a vague understanding of the chain of custody.
Okay, because this is just very fundamental, it's very basic. I would like to know who maintains control over the photograph. If you could walk me through the process. When the shutter is closed on that camera and the picture is captured, where does that picture go? Does it get transferred to Mesa, Arizona? Does it get transferred to the New York City Department of Finance? How does this work? Who maintains this picture? And ultimately, how many people or how many agencies does it filter through before it finally gets in my mailbox?
Well, the material is sent to New York City. I'm not sure whether it is DOT or Department of Finance, or NYPD for that matter, but there is a New York City employee, a technician who is swears out these summonses. They are an employee of the City of New York, and they act on the information provided. But that information that is provided is also, there is a technician that attests to having checked the equipment.
It has to go to a daily self-log and an annual calibration.
It goes into a daily log and and an annual calibration of the equipment is required.
So are you saying that a party, a person who works for the City of New York, swears to a statement without personal knowledge just by looking at a photograph that was transmitted to them from someplace, somewhere? How is that possible? How can that party swear or affirm that the photograph accurately depicts what transpired?
Mr. Blake, why do you rise?
Speaker, might I ask Mr. Castorina a question, please, that's relevant to this?
Mr. Castorina, will you yield?
No, not at this time.
Mr. Castorina will not yield at the moment.
They are swearing or attesting to the facts that are presented in the visual evidence.
So they were not there at the time that the alleged infraction or violation took place, but they are swearing or affirming to what? That they see a photograph? And do you think that that rises to the level of admissible evidence for the purposes of having somebody violated where they will be deprived of their financial resources?
Yes.
Okay, that's an honest answer. I disagree with it, but it's an honest answer. Okay, now going back to what we were discussing before, where I described that that the government is forbidden from engaging in sweeping surveillance systems without search warrants to look for offenders of crimes. Now, when a photograph is taken, does it only capture the vehicle, or does it capture something more? Does it capture the roadway? Does it capture a tree that may be in the vicinity? What is the size of the frame that is captured once that shutter is closed?
It captures the car, the license plate, and a portion of the street.
Okay. Now, Ms. Glick, I want you to imagine that something,
several, right?
Ms. Glick,
Just one or two because it has to pass the station.
I just want to make...
It actually captures 2 or 3 to allow for the calibration of the speed.
Okay. So now, when that picture is captured, arguably there are more items, if you will, in the frame other than the vehicle. Perhaps it's the roadway. Perhaps maybe people that are traversing the roadway or on the sidewalk nearby.
Hopefully they are on the sidewalk and not in front of the cars.
Well, would you agree that that would be captured in the photograph if they were present within the confines of that frame?
I would say that it's possible. I don't know how wide the field of vision is.
Now, in the event that somebody were to subpoena the frames for the purposes of proving either some other civil matter or criminal matter, what would happen if a party to another action, completely separate from the traffic infraction, issued a subpoena to the City of New York for information that was captured within a particular frame? Maybe, for instance, in a civil matter, there was a dispute about a party line or a wall or some other issue. What would happen to the subpoena? What would happen? What would the City of New York do in that case?
I believe that is beyond the purview of this legislation. I have no idea what would happen, but perhaps some months from now, you'll have an opportunity to tell us.
Well, that's very kind of you, Ms. Glick, and I always appreciate our debates. It's always, in good fun, and certainly I have enjoyed it in my time here in the Assembly. My point is that if a frame captures some act, whether it be criminal wrongdoing or something related to a civil issue, that the city would then be in a position to provide that information, to provide that data in another proceeding. And my point is, if you will, whether or not you believe that the city participating in this type of what I call wanton sweeping surveillance, if they're actually placing themselves in the middle of a variety of other actions that could be taking place.
Let me just respond that I am advised that, in fact, that it could not be subpoenaed for the purpose of a civil action. There would have to be some proof of a criminal event, and I believe that the gentleman's time.
I do believe that your time again has expired, Mr. Castorina, but thank you for your patience.
I'd like to take this opportunity to commend the sponsor of the bill. I think that the sponsor's aims and intent are quite laudable, and I think that we all can agree that we should be doing whatever we can to save lives, especially lives of children. There's no question about it. But I think that the point that I'm trying to make is that there are less restrictive means to do so that don't run amok of our Constitution. And that when we look at our intent, we should figure out a way to get to that point, to get to that end result by following the law, by making sure that we don't trample upon our constitutional rights. In addition, there clearly are issues with the vendor that is being used. It's an out-of-state vendor. Are there no New York State vendors? I don't know the answer to that question, but that's a good question, I think. I think we should be patronizing our New York vendors, particularly if they exist in this realm. The second question is, well, how are they being paid? Are they being paid per ticket that's issued? If they're being paid a commission based upon every summons that's issued, I think that we all have an obligation to examine and take a step further. Frankly, the information was not available today, was not provided, and that gives me great pause, great concern for pause in this matter. I think that you can infer that any corporation that has the ability to just continue to issue summonses, well, we have to make sure that they're actually doing it the right way if we are in agreement that this is constitutional. I don't believe it's constitutional. I believe we should be saving lives of children and making our roads safer, but we can do it in a less restrictive means. Thank you very much. I will be voting in the negative.
And Mr. Castorino is